attendance, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Debt as a Double-Edged Sword session of the FIU Growth Conference. My name is Josh Knickerbocker, and I'm an executive committee member of the Young Alumni Network. I'm looking forward to hearing from today's incredible speaker, along with all of you, with any questions that you may have for him. Before we get started, it'd be a great time to go over some ground rules that we have been having throughout the rest of the conference and which still apply now. We recommend using speaker view and not gallery view for best results. Participant microphones will be disabled during the presentation. And if the speaker asks for participation, if you have a question during the Q&A, please put it in the chat. We've scheduled a time for Q&A after the presentation, but please feel free to drop your question in the chat box and I'll make sure that the speaker gets it. And if you need help at any time, please message the meeting host through the chat box for assistance. And without further ado, I want to introduce our speaker, Horacio Aguirre.
Hi, thank you, Josh. It's an honor to be asked to speak to you all today, and I appreciate it. I know Saturdays are very important for everyone, so I'm glad. I'm honored that everyone took the time to come out today. I wanted to talk today. Well, first, introduce myself a little bit, just a little bit more of my background. I grew up in Miami, went to Belen, which is actually pretty close to FIU, then graduated from Miami-Dade College and eventually graduated from FIU in 2013. I was pretty lucky that while I was at Belen, at FIU, I got involved with the Student Managed Investment Fund. And that's how I ended up with an internship at JP Morgan in the private bank here in Brickell. And I've basically been there ever since. Started full-time in 2013, spent 3 years on the lending desk, and then have spent the last 4 or so on the investments desk. So actually the topic today is something that is very near and dear, not just personally, because I have been a user of debt personally, but also professionally, because I've spent times on both, a lot of time on both sides of the balance sheet, the assets and the liability side. So I'm happy to jump in and I think it makes sense to start with how I think about debt, maybe even taking a step back and talking about how I think about financials or individuals as a company. And then going through, we have a few questions that were posed to me from the great team here, and then eventually answering some of your questions. So to start off, I have a feeling that debt generally has a negative connotation. People usually think of debt as a bad word. One of the things I've learned is it can actually make individuals have smart decisions and be a smart use of their own personal balance sheet. Which leads me to sort of the main overview of this, which is, and I really picked this up with my time at JP Morgan, is it's important to think of yourself, especially as you're starting your career, almost as a small institution or a small company, right? You think about it as if you're an Apple or an Amazon. You generate revenue by providing a service or working somewhere. You have expenses, whether it's your home, your car, lifestyle, etc. And then you have your net earnings. That's basically how much you have left over after you're done with all of your personal expenses. And generally speaking, that should be a positive number, which would mean that your balance sheet will continue to grow over time. Now, if you say, how does debt affect that balance sheet? Well, you can borrow for many different reasons. You can borrow, number one, either for your lifestyle, or number two, I think just to sort of keep it high level for any investments that you might make, right? So if you think about it, funding from or borrowing for your lifestyle, that would be, maybe holding a credit card balance, using that to spend to buy clothes, maybe buying a car. Borrowing for investments, while sort of a gray area, you might think about as buying a home, buying an investment property, or even borrowing to invest in stocks or bonds. Generally speaking, that decision doesn't change depending on how wealthy or not you are. And speaking from experience, where you can have it be an individual that borrows very much or very little money with very little wealth, or I've seen on the other side of the spectrum, very wealthy individuals that actually use a lot of debt. Some they do well with, and others a little bit recklessly, right? And that's just more of a personality thing than anything. Today, we wanted to talk about what are the long-term implications of debt? What are the different types of debt? Are there good types of debt? And then going in through, I guess, the maybe bad types of debt, how do you think about paying off some of that debt? How would it affect your credit score? And then maybe how do you make that credit score work for you? There's also obviously, and I think many young graduates or young alumni are going to have to incorporate some student loans as part of that. And I sort of think about that as more of a positive investment debt, right? But so just taking a step back, what is the long-term implication of debt? So generally speaking, it just exaggerates any outcome that you may have already been having, right? And what I mean by that is if you are a user of debt, and going back to my company analogy, you are spending just about as much or spending more than you are earning, then you're probably going to be borrowing the highest cost of debt you can, which is going to be credit card debt. That could potentially lead to making a worse financial decision, even worse, because you're actually borrowing and then paying interest on that higher cost of debt. On the flip side, you could have a type of debt that I actually just went through myself, where I chose to stop living in an apartment and buying a home with my girlfriend. And so there I switched the process of, am I going to be paying out a fixed amount of rent every month, or am I going to start incurring what is a pretty large amount of debt all at once? But then with the idea that it's a manageable debt and something that I can pay down over a long period of time, right? And then you have even further, if you were to say, I'm starting my own business, like I'm sure many of you are considering doing that, or have already been doing that. And then the other question goes to, I'm starting my business, should I borrow to do so? Right? And we're going to get into maybe some of the implications of that, because obviously the more you can grow, even if it's through the use of debt, potentially the more successful you can be, right? And so why don't we jump into maybe what are the different types of debt? We'll start broad and then going through maybe what are some of the ones that might be considered good debt. So the different types of debt, as I've mentioned, sort of on a high level, are credit card debt or unsecured loans. Those I would generally say are probably in the negative category in terms of using debt, because you're generally paying anywhere between 10 to 20% interest. And the way I start to think about debt, whether it's good or bad, is generally by what is my opportunity cost of using this cash or taking on debt. And so the higher the cost of debt, the harder it is for me to earn that type of return doing anything else, right? Another type of debt is that a lot of us may be familiar with is either a mortgage or a car loan, so an installment type of debt. That generally speaking is going to be a much lower cost of debt because there's actually collateral behind it, your car or your house, and that may or may not be a good type of debt, right? We can get into whether that makes sense or not, but it doesn't necessarily have to be one or the other. And then finally, I think of debt in terms of investments front, right? And so this I deal with a lot with my clients, and mainly it's borrowing to make a financial investment or for a financial decision. And there, generally speaking, you might think that it is a good use of debt, but you might see, and as I lived through over the past course of this year, last 6, 7, 8 months, some individuals that borrowed to make financial investments ended up being on the wrong side of that when we saw the market crash in mid-March, right? And so I think there's a broad spectrum of whether debt is good or bad. And then I think not every type of debt would be one or the other. So what characterizes a good debt? Well, I think it's number one, going back to leverage or debt exaggerates an outcome. Number one, it should most likely be something, debt that you're incurring for a positive outcome, right? And generally speaking, if it's for a positive outcome, it may not be a debt that you need. I'm going to give you an example. Two of the largest companies in the world over the last few weeks have been issuing debt, Google and Amazon, right? You've seen Apple issuing debt. These are companies that absolutely do not need to be borrowing for any means, but they're doing so because they think, given what the cost of borrowing is, which interest rates where they are right now, they can borrow at under 2%. They definitely expect to be able to grow at above 2%, right? And so from a financial standpoint, as you all may know, they're basically betting that as long as the hurdle rate is low, let's say sub 2% borrowing costs, and they think they can grow at a much higher rate, then they're gonna just amplify their positive returns. That's just finance number one, 101. Then you think, well, if that is the case, wouldn't you borrow basically as much as you could to fund that? As I mentioned, we've seen this happen over the last few months where a lot of companies, even some that we may know very well, went bankrupt because they had too much debt on their balance sheet, right? And then that goes to what I previously mentioned of, it may be a good idea if you're borrowing to make an investment in something that's going to earn a higher return, but it may also be very important to know what the side effects of that could be. For example, if you're borrowing to make an investment like buying stock, there you could be subject to a margin call if the value of that stock goes lower. If you're borrowing to make an investment like buying a home, well, you're not going to have a margin call in that case. There's no one going to come to you and say the value of your home has declined for a short period of time. As long as you're able to make your payments, that might be a very good use of debt. And I use a home, but that could apply to any type of investment property or any type of business that you're making investment in, right? And so I think when you're making a decision about making a incurring debt for a financial gain, just making sure that it's within a moderate type of leverage level, right? And that could vary pretty dramatically depending on what type of investment you're making. If you're thinking of another type of good debt, which I mentioned to you, might be even buying something like a car, right? And this is, someone may not say that, well, buying a car makes a good decision, but if you have two options and you're saying, I need a form of transportation, I have cash, I can either buy a car today and finance it at 3% or even lower, or I can pay for it cash. Well, then the way to think about whether that would be a good use of debt or not is, can you do something else with that money that can eventually earn you more than what you're paying on your cost of debt, right? And then again, going back to thinking about yourself as a company or an institution, that is exactly what these large corporations do. Google and Apple and Amazon, they say, we have an extraordinary amount of cash and we generate an extraordinary amount of revenue, but if I can borrow and beat that hurdle rate, then it might be a good decision. And if you think about yourself in that same way, if you have $10,000, an example, to put towards a car, and you say, well, I can put down $1,000 and borrow $9,000 and invest that $9,000 at what you expect to be to have a higher return potential than the cost of the car, let's say 3%, then it might be a very good idea to do so. If you say, well, I'm not sure I can beat that because interest rates are much higher and I can borrow at 7%, then it might be your best bet to just pay with cash, right? And that's just, it's very high level, and we can go through and sort of more examples, but that's sort of how I'm thinking about it. What is a bad debt? So number one, and I can tell you, I've had many bad debts in the past, and especially as I was starting off and not making the best decisions I could have. One example of a bad debt is, and I saw this a lot, is borrowing to make investments that could eventually leave you with a situation that you now owe more than your investment is worth, right? You saw that happening a lot over the past few months, and that actually happened to me when I was first starting off with my E-Trade margin account, and it was a not fun way to spend a few $1,000s, right? Another example of a bad debt is a debt that could be for lifestyle purposes that isn't something that you think you can make more than. So I mentioned the hurdle rate, or the knowing what your cost of carry is. If it costs you 10 to 20% if it costs you 10 to 20% in order to pay off a credit card, well, that could be a very bad cost of debt if you're holding that for a long period of time, right? And so when you're thinking about it, it's a lot easier to think about what is a bad cost of debt and easily strike those out. A lot of that will most likely depend on what you're doing outside of debt, and actually how you're holding your personal income statement or your personal cash flow statement to account for that, because you probably will not be needing that if you're able to generate a good amount of personal earnings, which means you're actually saving and potentially investing more. So when I think about, and as someone who did this, when I would think about, how should you prioritize your debt? It's a very simple analogy. Or analysis. You want to pay off whatever is going to be your highest cost of debt first. There's a lot of books that talk about that, including one of my favorites, which is Rich Dad Poor Dad. And if you haven't read, you definitely should. I'm a big fan of his, and it's a pretty easy read. But one of the things that you need to think about is paying off your highest cost of debt, while at the same time making sure that you can live without having to incur further debt in order to do so. But if you're paying off your highest cost of debt little by little and living within your means in order to do so, then eventually you may be left with some debt that is actually usable and actually makes sense financially, like let's say a lower cost car loan or a mortgage, or maybe even an investment in your business. But it's going to be hard to do that and not feel the pressure of the higher cost debt until that's been paid off. And then when you think about, just on the next section in terms of your credit, obviously the higher credit score you have, the lower the cost it's going to be, the lower debt is going to cost you. Which is also why you want to make sure that, especially on your revolving credit cards, things like that, your higher cost of higher cost debts, you pay those down as soon as possible, because that will allow you the opportunity to then increase your credit score, which will then in the future earn you a lower cost of debt for anything that you may want to do in the future. As an example, going back to Google and Amazon and those companies and their borrowing, part of the reason why they're able to borrow at such low rates is almost because they don't have to, right? Because they don't have to, because they don't have balance sheets that have an exorbitant amount of debt, they're able to go in and take those same, use those same things to their advantage and then borrow at the lower rate. If you're thinking about how does that apply to you, if you're making the decision of whether to buy a home or not, and one of the things that's going to matter is, one of the things that's going to matter to you is the interest rate, because that's going to lead to what the monthly payment's going to be. The lower your outstanding balances from revolving balances and the higher your credit score, generally speaking, the lower interest rate and lower monthly payment you can expect to pay when you're buying a house or buying a car on those installment loans, right? I've talked for about 15 minutes now. I saw a couple questions floating in. Josh, I don't know if you have questions or you want to kick it off with anything that I may have missed or you want me to dive into.
Definitely. Matthew brought up in the chat that when you say pay off the higher cost of debt first, are you referring to the highest as in the highest monthly payment amount? or the higher cost over time in terms of interest rate accumulation based on percent imbalance?
So I would say start with the highest interest rate cost of debt. And the reason why is because, especially when you're thinking about debt that will compound, the highest interest rate will usually compound will basically leave you to have more and more debt accumulating over that time period, right? And so you might actually have a high monthly payment on debt that might be an installment loan, but if the interest rate's actually very low, it may not be a priority for you to pay off. The reason being is it's not, if it does compound, it's going to compound at a much lower rate. And if it doesn't compound, then you're going to be able to invest what you maybe would have used to pay that off and actually earn more if you think you can. As an example, my highest debt right now is my mortgage. I have a roughly 3.5% interest rate. I have no interest in paying that down quickly because I think over a very long period of time, let's say 30 years, I can earn more than 3.5% over a long period of time. And as long as I keep that long-term framework, that's how I'm thinking about it. If I had debt at 7% interest rate, and especially if it was compounding interest on it, then that would be my number one debt I would take out before the mortgage, because I think maybe 7% might be a higher hurdle rate for me to beat when I'm investing, right?
Right. That leads into Alex's question, which I thought was a good segue, bouncing off of this. How should you handle student loans? Like when someone gets that first job out of college, should they just go ahead and start paying off as much as they can? And more importantly, how do they balance that with their 401k and any savings that they have?
Yeah, so this is I will be honest, I had one student loan that I took out while I was at FIU. I used it to actually make investments because it was during the first tranche that I believe my rate was 99, was basically a percent or so. And I did not have to incur some higher percentage student loan rates. I have had a lot of friends and colleagues that did incur, more expensive student loan rates. And part of what they've managed to do is, especially while they were working, is either restructure them somehow into maybe a lower interest payment installment loan, or begin to whittle down at that interest payment. I would say the way to think about it is student loans are nice because I believe they offer you a good amount of flexibility in payment. But at the same time, if you're paying 5% or 6% or higher in this interest rate environment, you may think it's worth to start paying those down. If you don't think and again, this goes back to your cost of the debt versus what you think you can earn. If you think you can earn more, then you should probably be investing that. But then again, it's more important about feeling comfortable, right? Just as an example, if it's something that's keeping you up at night, just from a personal psychological perspective, then the best thing for you to be doing is to paying that down, right? Because it's going to allow you the freedom, mental freedom, if anything, to go and enter into other endeavors, whereas you may not be able to if you have that overhang or that sort of weight on your shoulder.
Right, agreed. There's a very big mental aspect to it that a lot of people tend to forget about, and that also ends up being an important factor in making those decisions. That also leads into Maria's question in general. What's your take on debt consolidation? Is it worth it to consolidate debt? Like I know there's a lot of these credit card promotions that say 0% interest for 24 months, just do a balance transfer or take out a loan from us to pay off your other loans. We have a lower interest rate. And does it have a negative impact on your credit in the future?
So my thinking on that is that it could obviously depend. I have looked at them in the past and done some digging on them. I think if you're going to be able to find a true, honest, and it's tough because it's a very subjective way to think about it, but an honest debt consolidator, which might require you to be doing a bit of research yourself, that will be able to consolidate higher cost debt into a lower cost installment loan, then I definitely would be open to looking at that idea. If you're talking about consolidating some credit card debt, which may be 15 or more % interest, and you're able to do it at a fixed payment at even 8 or 9%, then that definitely might be worth considering, because at that point you could be saving yourself potentially thousands and thousands of dollars compounded over how many years if it takes you that long to pay that off. If it's something that could have prepayment penalties, or if you're not able to pay that certain installment payment, whereas the credit card you have more flexibility, and then it automatically jumps up to a much higher credit card like rate, then I would definitely steer clear of something like that, right? That seems to be like much more of a teaser than something that could be beneficial.
Right. It's all in the fine details and what sort of debt you're trying to consolidate.
Exactly.
David has a very interesting question. I should think that this is paramount for young alumni that may be trying to consider next steps. What should I consider when deciding between whether I should invest in purchasing an apartment? Let's take it a step further, purchasing an apartment or a first home, whatever it may be, or going into a grad school program that costs at least over $150,000.
Yeah, that's a tough question, right? Because then I think you need to weigh what you expect to earn coming out of that grad school program, right? I can tell you, I weighed a similar decision about maybe not buying a home, but about actually working versus getting my MBA, right? Which is I guess similar. Whereas if I'm working, I'm actually generating that revenue side. Which I guess if you bought your home, you could think of, even though you're incurring debt, you're also expecting some long-term appreciation of the home, which would increase your balance sheet. It's a very personal choice. It's something you need to really keep in mind. Weigh all the outcomes. $150,000 with student loans could be a very big hurdle rate for you to overcome in the future. And so it's something that is very personal. To me, I ultimately decided right now I didn't need to go to graduate school. A lot of it also took into account I wasn't making a career switch. I have a lot of friends and colleagues that have done so because they've wanted to make a career switch, and they thought, even though they're incurring $150,000 or $200,000 of student loans, they can make that and more coming right out of school, right? And so for them, it was an easy decision to make. For me, it was one that I decided to continue working.
Got it. Yep, that definitely has to be a personal decision, but that insight is still very appreciated, and I'm sure everyone can weigh in on that depending on their circumstances. I did want to get to a question from Natalie. Do you have any personal influences for that you listen to for financial decisions? Like some people listen to Dave Ramsey's podcast and other people may listen. Do you have any influences in that regard?
Yeah. Bigger Pockets is probably the biggest one that I listen to as far as a podcast. And I also look at I'm like the oldest young person. I recently got into YouTube during this time period, since I've been home so much, and they've been looking at a bunch of like investing videos and things like that, also from Bigger Pockets. There's another, if you're more interested in what's going on in the day-to-day of financial markets, Adam Crisafulli is actually used to work in our investment bank at JP Morgan, and now runs a podcast called Breaking Dawn. Mm-hmm. And let me just make sure that's the right name. But the idea of the podcast is, every single morning he comes out with what are the most important financial news that you'd want to know. The other at this point, I probably couldn't stress enough that I think is important is just reading Vital Dawn. I'm glad it is reading. I mentioned Rich Dad Poor Dad as an example. I think reading and I have had a hard time I've been said I have ADD and ADHD, and so for me, sitting down and reading is something that's very tough. For those of you that are in a similar boat, listening to audiobooks can be very helpful, right? And so I love driving. And so for me, listening to audiobooks as I'm driving is some of the biggest things I listen to. And I would just start anywhere on that front. Anything under the financial or help audiobooks is going to be awesome.
Great. And of course, Horatio gave some great suggestions there, especially for those of you that like to drive and sometimes just put something in the car that you want to listen to. That's also brain food, so to speak.
Yep.
Another question I guess I want to ask, because I'm sure there's a couple people here, either young alumni or undergraduates in the College of Business, that are curious about your career path. So why private banking and why not investment banking and all the other fields associated with finance?
This is going to make me sound really dumb. When I got into private banking, I didn't know. I mean, obviously, I figured out what it was before I went to the interviews, but I didn't know what private banking was. I saw the opening. My professor mentioned it in a class, and I had no idea what private banking was. I thought I wanted to be an investment banker, because when you think about what an investment banker does, you think an investment banker invests money. You know, turns out they don't do that. Turns out, investors or private bankers actually invest money and manage money for clients. And I got a little lucky that even though I didn't really know what I was getting into, that's why I ended up at the private bank. Now, why didn't I look at anything else? Maybe this goes back to the whole, I can't focus on any one particular thing for too long. But the markets change on a not just daily, but hourly or every minute. And to me, it's always been exciting that I could think I'm the smartest guy yesterday, but almost every morning I wake up and like I mentioned, I listen to that podcast and I read as much as I can on the financial news every morning, because I almost have to relearn everything I knew about the market every morning. And so to me, that was a lot of fun. I also like being a generalist on that front. And so one of the things that I get to do within the private bank is I get to advise clients not only on overall portfolio construction, but also trade currencies, commodities, stocks, bonds, invest in private investments, sort of get to go across the whole scope. Whereas in investment banking and other aspects of wealth management, you may be tied to a specific asset class, or even within asset classes, a specific group, right? Like the equity analyst that analyzes Apple is not analyzing Home Depot, right? They're two totally different businesses. And so I like the more generalist aspect of it.
Sean had a question where for young alumni, it can be difficult for a credit card company to give a credit card to a student or someone just fresh out of college that has a large balance or has a potential to large balance. So that's why a lot of students tend to get several credit cards that add up to that large balance. What is your opinion on having several well-managed credit cards that you can, instead of having to be able to carry a high credit balance on something and make a quick investment?
I don't think it's a bad idea at all. I mean, I think I probably still have my first credit card, which was from Macy's. I'll tell you, I started with a Capital One credit card that I still have to this day. And one of the reasons why, and that's actually a good question, because one of the things that credit card companies and credit score companies look at is how long you've had credit for. Right. And so as silly as it may seem, your Macy's card or your Capital One card, or for me, it was Discover Next, which I sort of slowly kept building up not a balance, but a limit. Those are what really anchor my credit score right now in terms of the length of me having them. Right. Later, you might end up getting a newer credit card, which has a much higher limit, and you'll be surprised to see that your credit score actually dropped. And it's because your average length of credit card balances credit card length went down. One thing that I use, and I don't know if I should plug anything or not plug anything, but Credit Karma is great, right?
Yeah.
And Credit Karma helps. They get an update once a week, and so you'll see what's affecting your score, what's helping you, and what recent items have detracted from it. I don't know if that's helpful.
I mean, it's definitely very helpful. If you guys haven't been able to check your credit score, or at least sort of report, I think a resource like Credit Karma is a good place to start. I believe they even have a section that shows what sort of cards you could qualify for based on your general profile.
Yeah. One other thing I would mention on that also, it's important to keep, from what I understand, below 30% on your overall credit card balances. I would I would try, if you are managing across a few different credit cards, to get to that balance that you think you might need, which isn't a bad idea, right? It's always good to have credit available to you when you don't need it. That way, if you ever do need it, not that you want to fall back on it or have to, but it's nice to know that you have sort of that, a bit of a safety net, even if it's for the short term. But staying within 30% of your overall, but then also below 30% of each individual card. And I think it might even be better if you stay below 15 of each individual card as well.
Right. Perfect. Does anyone else have any questions for Horatio today? I guess one thing that I did want to make sure to touch on is, what advice do you have for young alumni, people that are either just getting into the workforce or about to get into the workforce, especially in a post-COVID world where things tend to be remote and where job openings for the most part might be a little sparse right now as companies reassess what they need in the coming year?
Yeah, look, it's tough. Just to be very blunt about it, we had our interns, our internship program just ended, and the entire program was virtual, right? And so you're unfortunately, you're gonna be entering into a very unique time. I would say it's not gonna be as bad as those individuals that entered the workforce after 2008 and 2009, because I don't think this is going to be a very long recession. Whereas that was a very long recession. I think this is going to be a very short-lived recession, and potentially may be a lot closer to back to normal as we're entering the next year. That being said, I think a lot of companies are going to re-examine what they need to spend money on. Luckily, I think that if you are a well-educated, driven, you want to be a well-educated, driven employee or potential employee, then it actually may be cheaper for companies to hire you, right? Because they may be able to actually consolidate some of their expenses where they thought that they needed to pay for a huge office space in Brickell Avenue. Now they may have you doing the same work from your home, right? And so in that aspect of it, I think you're going to see companies shifting their spending to maybe some real estate and some sort of infrastructure on their end, spending to hiring people that they think are going to actually help them grow their bottom line.
Michael wanted to ask, what factors go into how a person is evaluated for a student loan?
That I don't know. I want to be very honest. Since I didn't take a lot of student loans myself, I don't want to give you any misinformation.
Javier, do you have any advice on how to get rid of excessive debt? I'm sure this goes into a little bit of what you had mentioned earlier about trying to see what the highest interest rate is first and then paying that down first, but I guess any other tips generally?
Yeah, I'll tell you, as someone that had balances on a credit card in the past when I was first starting out, one of the things that I used is I actually set aside a certain amount of money that went to a separate, when I started working, that went to a separate bank account, and that account was used specifically to pay off my high interest rate credit card. I think you probably also need to be very honest with yourself about how you incurred some of that debt. And then if it was for a very good reason, and it may have been, right? You may say, I'm starting a new job and I need to buy 3 new suits for that job. And because I wasn't working, I didn't have the money. That might be a great reason. And that could actually end up, thinking about the choices you make, that could actually end up making you look better in the workforce, which ends up making you a higher paid employee, right? And so let's say you incur that, but now you know that's expensive, you need to pay it down. I'd say setting a strict plan on paying that down would be the most important thing. And again, starting with the highest compound interest credit card first, or any loan first.
And I guess very generally as a point to end on, because it kind of encapsulates this entire conversation, I'm sure you and I have our opinions as both being people employed in the financial services industry, but how important is it for everyone, whether they are an ultra high net worth person or student starting out, to have some sort of financial plan?
I actually have been amazed at the amount of just from a professional standpoint, people I've worked with that have made an incredible amount of wealth for themselves and are not necessarily educated from the financial aspect of it, right? They may have been the best at what they were doing, but they didn't study finance like many of you did, or didn't go to business school like many of you did. They were just either very creative or visionaries in what they were doing. I think it's very important. I think it's very important to know accounting yourself. I think it's very important for everyone to have a financial statement of a personal financial statement that is a balance sheet, that is a income or cash flow statement, because it helps everyone stay honest with if they're achieving their financial goals or not, right? It's very easy to say, oh, I want to be a millionaire by the time I'm 30. But if when you actually put pen to paper, you realize, well, even under a very extreme, positive scenario, it's going to be very tough because you're not actually spending as little as you need to, or maybe you're not earning as much as you need to, and maybe it's just refocusing some of what you're doing. So I think that should be a top priority for an artist or a teacher or an accountant or someone in finance, just across the board.
Definitely. And that plan is something that'll help you manage your financial plan, also your debt in a more manageable way.
Yeah.
All right, everyone, thank you for attending today's session, and thank you, Horatio, for taking the time to speak with everybody today. And I definitely found this very informative, and I know everyone in the audience did as well.
Awesome. Thank you guys for having me. I really appreciate it. I'm obviously honored to be asked to be here. And if anyone has any other questions, feel free to reach out to me personally. I'm always happy to help.
Great. Thank you.
Great weekend.